Cordero Show. Now, if you remember last week, we were talking about European colonialism. I showed you the map of how Africa looked before, how it looked during colonialism, and how Africa looks in the now. Now, I stopped at the point when I was explaining shallow colonialism, and this week's is basically a continuation of that. Now, there's an article written by Bruce Gilley. The article is titled "The Case for Colonization," or "The Case for Colonialism." And it argues that colonialism was objectively good and beneficial, and it was needed, and it was also legitimate. Colonialism should be recovered and redone by recolonizing Africa, either by reinstituting European colonial styles of government, or redeveloping the continent of Africa for the weak state. This is Bruce Gilley's argument. It was published in the Third World Journal, Third World Quarterly, which was pretty much very controversial. I mean, this article was big in international relations and political science because of how absurd it was. Now, there is also another argument which was written back in the 80s by a famous writer. His name is Christopher Clapham. And Clapham's work in a book called The Third World Politics argued that colonialism benefited Europe. That was unquestionable. It benefited economically, and some countries in Europe that were less developed or less industrialized, like Belgium or even France, grew the amount of wealth that they had and access to resources that wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't colonized. On the other hand, Africa did not get fully the benefits of colonialism. That it was an half-baked cake in the sense that what it promised, which for many Europeans, there are many reasons for colonizing Africa, but for some of them really believed in these ideas of integrating Africa to the colonial economy and also their civilization mission. But this was not fully done, in that traditional norms, societies, and ways of life have prevailed. So now in the post-colonial society, you have a situation where these two ideas, the forces of pre-colonial Africa and the forces of colonial Africa, are always conflicting. And then this results in what we call post-colonial societies. So post-colonial societies are in conflict between the past and the present, and it's a predicament that many African countries find themselves in. And in the form of legal framework, economic framework, institutional frameworks, and just everything, and cultural identity and pride. And it is not a good place to be in, because it's one where you don't know if you are going forward or if you're going backward. This is Christopher Clapham. Now, a text for this theory will be Ethiopia, which I didn't mention last week, but under the rulership of Menelik, who was the Ethiopian empire at the time, and in a battle called the Battle of Adowa in 1896, the Ethiopians prevailed against a very threatening Italian empire. And Ethiopia remained as the only country that was not occupied by European powers, except for the time when Italy went there under Mussolini shortly before World War II. Now, if you look at Ethiopia now, and in the colonial era, it's pretty much the same. But is Ethiopia a good example of knowing how Africa would have turned out had it not been colonized? That's a question out there. The debate is out. Now, colonial administration was done in so many ways. And it is important to make the argument that it was, for the most part, a colonial affair. And as Clapham has said, it benefited Europe. But the way it was done changed in different times. And I'm going to illustrate this. Now, in the earlier part of colonialism, it was done through charter companies. These companies were private concessions that were given power to go and colonize these territories, and involving quite a bit of violence, horrible things, killing people, forced labor, and they didn't care. They just had to acquire these properties. And the companies included British Royal Niger Company, which was in charge of West Africa, including Nigeria area, British South African Company, Leopold's Free State of the Congo, British East African Company, German East Africa. And one of the things which allowed these companies to be very successful was the invention of quinine. Yes, an earlier version of what Trump's medicine, hydrochloroquine. Now, the quinine made it possible as a medication for Europeans to live in Africa without being worried about yellow fever and malaria. So they could settle there and do a little more colonial projects. Now, as the number of companies increased in the continent and Europeans coming down to see what was going on, there was increasing information on how brutal these companies were to the natives. And missionaries especially started complaining. Now, the colonial government changed their method of colonialism from concessions and private companies to the empire itself sending administrators in what was first called the indirect rule, which is pretty much well documented in Frederick Lugard's book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. Lugard was the founding colonizer of East Africa and also Nigeria later on. And Lugard argued that Africans were children and they needed a parent, somebody to teach them ways to be disciplined, not to be laughing anyhowly, and to teach them a way to live in a modern world. And one way of doing this was to talk with colonial officers in such a way that they would let the colonial natives rule. Chiefdoms like the Sokoto Caliphate will exist as it is, but will take orders from British colonial officers. There is also the idea that the native management will be codified on European terms, so they will have some sort of bureaucracy. And indirect rule was used in places that are called protectorates, that were not necessarily profitable to the British, but still nonetheless important. So you had like Uganda Protectorate, Swazi Protectorate, protectorates of northern Nigeria in the Sokoto area. So this is how they will rule. They will work with the natives who are still brutal, but take orders from the headquarters of the empires. Now, another form of colonial rule was the direct rule. And this is very important to understand. The direct rule was primarily a function of the French, the Portuguese, and the Belgians. And they emphasize an aspect of rule called assimilation. In direct rule, there is transfer of the colonial apparatus from the center, in the case of France, Paris, into the colonial spaces. And here you see the taking of these colonial administration zones as entities of the empire. So French colonies were really part of France, and they saw them as such. And colonial officers attempted to assimilate, Christianize, teach them French ways and French style of living. And people who had undergone this process of assimilation were called the evolvés, the civilized Africans. And an example here, Leopold Senghor, who goes into France and is elected as a member of parliament, and later on comes back to lead the anti-colonial movements in Senegal. So colonies were departments. To this day, there are countries in Africa, Mayotte, Reunion, that are still part of France, and France saw them as such. You could see this in Algeria as well. So direct rule is when there is a lot of interest from the central government in Europe to totally control and subdue these native accusations. And it employed a great deal of resources to this project. And then another way which colonialism operated was through settler states. And this is important. A good book that discusses this in detail is The Africa in the World History by Eric Gilbert and Jonathan Reynolds. And the settler states was, as European industrialization increased, there was also a surge in population and an increasing number of people were unemployed. Now, Europe decided to send excess population. So you see people in America increasing immigration from Europe to America, to Argentina, Australia, in places that were called dominions of the British Empire. But in Africa, they were called settler colonies. And here you have South Africa, where there was a big, almost 10% of the population was white. Namibia, which later on became a colony of South Africa, the only one in sub-Saharan Africa where another African country colonizes another. You also have a case here in Kenya, where there's a substantial amount of white settlers, and Rhodesia as well as Algeria, where the French were living there. And in these settler colonies, it was much more brutal in the way that it attempted to destroy native lifestyles and also to turn these economies into productive engine for this citizen. So to this day, you find that settler states tend to be slightly more developed than other colonies of Europeans. And this is because there was an impetus on the part of the colonial masters to make sure that their citizens who were exported abroad lived a life that was close to their own. But it also means that in the struggle against colonialism, these settler states had to use violence because there was not enough of ease to release them, because they were wondering what they would do with this excess population. So settler colonies like the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola delayed their struggle almost up to 1975, because what were they going to do in Portugal? You also see incredible violence in Kenya and in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa because of this idea. But the idea of settling these lands that were favorable in climate, looked like Europe in some ways, was legitimated by a concept called res nullius. Res nullius, the idea that the European had the right to conquer these lands because the natives were not using them, that they were wild lands. And because they were wild, the Europeans had to make them profitable. And this was legalized under Roman codes that had existed in Europe for a while. So the takeover of African lands and displacement of people was legitimate in their eyes because of this idea, which was res nullius, which for many Africans, they had no idea of and did not respect. But for Europeans, it was the ultimate legal backdrop for displacing of natives in the settlers' colonies. Now, I will continue later next week to elaborate more into the details, but in briefly, colonialism leads to cash crop farming, extractive resources, as you can see in railway lines and infrastructures that really benefit Europe rather than Africa. There's also paternalistic rule, which Africans are treated as children. They are beaten. Their ability to move from one area to another is limited and curtailed. And also the creation of ethnicities, ethnic groups that previously did not exist, but are now codified and made to exist, like the Luyas and the Kalenjin and the Tutsis and the Hutus in Rwanda, the Igbos in Nigeria. These ideas were not really existing, but they were created to make it possible to rule. Now, if you like what I'm presenting here and you like to be part of it, Don't fail to subscribe and to join us next week for another detailed analysis of colonial rule. Thank you so much.